Hello, my friends. This recording is purposely for those of you who have your exam coming up in the next 3 to 5 days. If your exam is coming up real quick, you'll find value from this. It is also for those whose exams may be tomorrow, because you can take a look at this and get the top of the waves of what you need to remember for your exam. So let's jump in. I call this the final push to exam success. Now, you might have heard me present on this before, but this is the final push to exam success in 2022. So if you've watched a previous version of this one will supersede that. I am going into a lot more details. First of all, let me say, understand the flow of events in all the knowledge areas. In integration, take a look at the charter. Take a look at the project management plan. Those are big. And also remember the flow across to close project or phase. You got to remember what happens in each one of these areas. So freeze the screen and take a look if you've forgotten. You also need to remember the sequence of change requests. You may first of all get it in formal writing, or you might get it verbally. The bottom line is you need to process that change request as a project manager and ensure that you've reviewed it and you've passed the information onto the change control board if there is one. You also need to remember how scope flows. Now, the big ticket items in scope are your requirements traceability matrix, your project scope statement, and your scope baseline. Those are huge. You also need to remember in the aspect of schedule, the real schedule is the compilation of the start and end dates. It's not the entire thing, but the start and end dates are important. It's not every single aspect like the Gantt chart that makes the schedule. The schedule does need to have the activities, their linkages, their start and their finish dates. In this area, you got to understand the concept of the activity list and the milestone list. You also need to understand at a high level network diagrams. You also need to understand what a BOE is and what duration estimates are. Lastly, you got to remember there's a difference between your schedule baseline and your project schedule. The baseline is etched in stone. The schedule will be changing. Now, going into cost, big ticket item is, again, cost estimates and BOEs, cost baseline, and lastly, the topic of cost forecast, which comes up under control costs. Now, I'm not recommending knowing the formulas, but I am recommending knowing the formulas for earned value, not for the forecasting per se, but the earned value. So I'm talking about SPI, CPI, CVSV, know those and the implication of those. As far as quality is concerned, you got to know your quality tools. It's that simple. And then you also need to understand the concept of quality audits that happens in managed quality. And for quality control, you got to understand the concept of verified deliverables, which means your stamp of approval. In resource management, the big ticket items I would recommend is your resource management plan, definitely your team charter, understanding what is happening in developed team. This is where you're coaching, training, and developing the team. Managed team, you got to understand that's really code for leadership. Going into communications, you understand the communication model, sender receiver models and how those pan in. What do you do when communications isn't working? You got to tweak the plan. You got to make it better, or you got to uphold the adherence to the plan if people are not obeying the plan. So what we have as far as the outputs, not really that much of a deal. It's really what is happening in communications. In the aspect of risk, you got to understand your 5 strategies for negative risks or threats and your 5 strategies for positive risks or opportunities. Definitely your risk management plan and risk register, your risk report. Those are, of course, very important. Moving on to procurement. In procurement, you got to understand the dynamics of what is happening. You got to understand the concept of contract types, payment types, your procurement strategy versus your procurement management plan. You got to keep those in mind as well. This is one of the areas we have the most unique stuff, this plan procurement management. And understand the dynamics of conduct procurements. You advertise, you receive proposals back. You may have a bit of conference. You may go into negotiating. You may go into finally awarding a contract after a lot of negotiating. And then control procurements is where we actually close the procurements. Last but not least, we have stakeholder management, and things to remember here: your stakeholder register, the power interest grid, influence impact grid, all that stuff, the stakeholder engagement plan, and the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. And that concludes the knowledge areas. Now, going into your state of mind for the exam, you got to be calm, cool, confident, collected. If you are going into a test center, my friends, be cool, calm, confident, and collected, but not so collected that you are not A, for aware and action ready. You got to be aware and action ready, ready to pivot accordingly. What happens? You find you've only got 10 minutes left and you got 50 questions. Pivot accordingly. Ensure all those questions are answered. Perhaps there's a power cut in the test center. People are going crazy. You need to stay calm, right? I say lead yourself, less is more. And what that means is the night before, be disciplined to shut it down, have an early night, watch a movie that you like, have some good food, go to bed. And that is calm, cool, confident, and collected, aware, leading yourself. And M is being mindful of time on the exam, mindful of your resources. You got to chunk the exam into bits of 75, 75, 75. First 60 questions, 75 minutes. Second batch, another 75, and the last, another 75. That is going to help you better manage time on the project. Now, let's talk about the mindset. The bottom line is this: in all of project management, whatever the domain, whether you're going to say it's people, process, or business, or whether you're going to say it's agile or hybrid, the bottom line is it's going to fall into initiating, which is authorization, planning, developing a plan, sprint planning, and all that stuff. Or it's going to fall into the doing, the sprint itself, the daily scrum, right? The executing of the work, the generating of data. Or it's going to be check. It's going to be looking for those impediments. It's going to be chasing them down. It's going to be investigating. It's going to be something to the effect of your sprint review, or the customer is inspecting the deliverable, or you're having a retrospective, right? And then you've got act, do something in response to your findings. So problem solve, create a work performance information, and put that into work performance reports. And lastly, closing out the project or phase. You got to be ready to face questions of all types. Again, I'm going to show you high level and just talk about the question. I don't need you to read the question, but I need you to get into the mindset of seeing stuff like this. 3 lines long. How are you going to feel? You're going to feel good. You're going to answer the question to the best of your ability. What do you derive when you go through developing a project charter? Well, exit criteria and milestones. That's really what this is testing. Or planning. You got a question that looks like this. It could look intimidating. So I want you to read through it. I want you to hit the pause button and decide what could the answer be. And then look at the answer. Here's the answer. Procurement strategy. This is really what this question is alluding to. These are more predictive type questions, right? Executing. You're going to get questions that could look this small, 2 lines. I mean, this looks rather friendly. All right. Hit the pause button if you need to. The answer to this: communications management plan. All right. Here's another one. Imagine a question this long. Yes, you can get questions this long. And they'll ask you, what do you think you should do? The answer to this one, hit the pause button if you need more time, is A. And here's the closing process group. And of course, you're going to get questions that hone in on the topic of closing. All right, now while I don't have one of those to show you, here's some other questions. You shouldn't be afraid of questions that look like this. Here's the answer. There's the logic. Okay, get used to seeing questions in this vein. It is important that for your exam, you be aware of certain rules. These rules will help guide your exam, okay? So you got to understand the purpose of a change request. Is it corrective action, preventive action, defect repair, or is it updates? The next law, you got to understand that lessons learned is not the same as feedback. What am I saying? It is better to get direct feedback from a stakeholder in a certain circumstance than just relying on a lesson learned from a previous unassociated project, right? When it comes to answers surrounding leadership, they tend to be less about procedure and process. So you got to go in those instances more with how the feeling of the question is, servant leadership. When we talk about escalation, it may not be necessary except you're dealing with things outside of your control. If you're dealing with a risk that is within the project jurisdiction, then you don't need escalation. But if it's outside of your control, at that point, you do need to escalate if it's outside of the project domain. Another mindset is negotiate for resources. Functional managers are important. So don't take no for an answer. Someone says this resource isn't available. What is the best you could do? Negotiate for resources. When we talk about stakeholder engagement versus planning, it's two different things. You could engage a stakeholder by doing. That's collaboration. That's engaging the stakeholder. That is a sure way to succeed in by actually engaging a stakeholder versus saying, we have a plan. Okay, you have a plan, but are you engaging the stakeholder? No, we've got a plan. It's not gonna work because you're not engaging the stakeholder. So you need to favor the actual engagement of stakeholders as a way of really sucking them in, roping them in, getting them to be fully engaged. Now, also be aware that expert judgment has its limits. You can't use expert judgment when you're in a new market. A new market needs experiments, not expert judgment, right? So expert judgment is limited if there's no prior experience. Secondly, or whatever the number is, look for signs when plans are not working. Usually a question will lead you down a path to see, this is not working, do something different. Another big one, huge for your exam, is always solve the problem. Don't allow the problem to get away. Solve it. Don't say, well, there's nothing I can do, or deferring it to someone else or saying no. Those are not good options. For your exam, solve the problem. When it comes to virtual teams, remember that virtual teams are important. That is the way forward in the world today. So you can expect to get a whole bunch of these questions about virtual teams. Now, one of my PMP gurus shared a bunch of lessons learned. She said that it was almost like 90% Agile on her exam. Now, I really want to comment on the fact that not everyone is going to get an ultra Agile exam. Some of you will, some of you won't. If you don't, are you ready to face the ultra predictive exam or the moderately predictive exam? Whatever the titration, you need to be ready. You need to say, I can face predictive, I can face Agile, I can face hybrid. That needs to be your mindset, right? For the knowledge areas, communication, resource management, risk, they could appear heavy. Just remember, everyone has a different exam configuration. Now, this student read the PMBOK, the Agile Practice Guide, and the Scrum Guide. I would highly advise it. She also read the Essentials book from Praizion. In this case, some of you may read the Immersion book, right? And test your knowledge and pound it until you feel extremely comfortable. So Christina, at the end of the day, made it, and she's probably forgotten that she's given us these lessons learned. She's now PMP guru. All right, so the final push to success, to conclude this, my friends, I want to tell you pages in this book that you should be aware of. The first page is pages 8 and 9. Those have the Agile Manifesto. The next one is page 14. That has a Stacy model. The next one is page 18, which has characteristics of project life cycles. That one where you have that table, remember? Next one is a continuum of life cycles, page 19. I would also like you to review pages 21, 22, 23, and 24 to go into the characteristics of the life cycles. And then let's jump ahead to page 33, where we talk about servant leadership. Page 37, the role of the project manager in the world of Agile. And then you have some really important stuff, the table on page 41 in the Agile Practice Guide. And then jump ahead to pages 49, 50, 51. So we're talking about the charter and the team. We're talking about common Agile practices such as retrospectives, backlog preparation, backlog refinement, daily stand-ups, demos or reviews, planning for iteration-based agile, which is more like sprint planning. And then we're talking about continuous integration, testing at all levels, and the concept of TDD and spikes. And then moving on, pages 58 and 59, again, still in this book, monumentally important. If you haven't taken a look at those pain points and the troubleshooting possibilities, I would advise that you do. You also need to understand the concept of burn ups and burn downs and how those two are different. You also need to understand, from what I'm hearing, the idea about earned value on page 69. You also need to understand the concept of the CFD, the cumulative flow diagram, what it does. Just read it. It will become more apparent to you. I would also advise page 77, where you have procurements and contracts, multi-tiered, emphasizing value delivered, fixed price increments, NTE and materials, graduated time and materials, early cancellation, dynamic scope, team augmentation, and favoring full service suppliers are all big things to be aware of. Last but not least, getting down to the wire, you need to understand pages 90 to 95. This is where you have page 25 again. That's right. Page 25 in this book actually appears on this breakdown as well in the Agile Practice Guide, which is crazy. That's on page 90. In closing, my friends, I would say go through the glossary, okay? Go through the glossary and make sure you've mastered every definition in the glossary. If it's in the glossary, you got to understand what it means to some degree, all right? That would be my advice, but you got to remember, you got this. Do you know that? Or are you shaking and shivering in your shoes? Don't do that. Don't shake, don't shiver. Understand you've put in the time, the effort, the energy, and you are going to crush this with your bare hands. Do you remember all the time you put in studying? Well, now's the time for you to have some confidence and faith in yourself, because if you don't, it could hurt you. Word of caution and advice: if you're taking the exam at home, you got to be ready for craziness. Craziness happens at home for a lot of people. Things go off, suddenly the connection isn't working, they say you moved out of frame, craziness. Be ready to face that. If you haven't already booked it at home, I would recommend you book it in the test center. That's just me, okay? And if you are struggling and you're like, Phil, that's a lot of stuff. How am I going to do all that? I need some sort of course to help me. I want you to go on down to hpmexam.com. It's called the Hybrid Project Management Immersion. Go to hpmexam.com and you can sign up for our next immersion training. The next one is this weekend. So go on down, hpmexam.com. It's very low cost, low risk, but my goodness, it's wildly effective. You will be so delighted that you signed up for this half-day boot camp. All right. Again, is hpmexam.com. I got to put it up here so that you remember HPM, right? H for hybrid, hpmexam.com. All right. And when you get done with your exam, I'd love for you to report back and let me know your great news of success. You take care. I wish you all the very best. Bye for now.